Hello and welcome to one of the in-depth sessions of our workshop, Best Practices, Optimization and Troubleshooting. I'm your host, Mattia Tommasone, and I'm a developer relations engineer working on the Google Ads API, just like most of the hosts of the previous sessions. I will walk you through some tips and tricks to make sure that your applications make the most of the Google Ads API for Performance Max campaigns. This session is mostly geared towards software developers building applications on top of the Google Ads API. There will be a few snippets of code throughout the session, but we will also see some best practices that apply to Performance Max as a product, regardless of whether you are building your own applications with the Google Ads API. So here are the topics that we will be covering. First of all, we will discuss which API requests need to be bundled together and which can be issued separately. We will also discuss the main reasons for bundling requests and for not bundling them, and I will show you some tricks on how to bundle your requests optimally. After that, we will discuss the requirements for assets and asset types when creating different types of Performance Max campaigns. And then, we'll talk about how your campaigns may end up in an invalid state, even if the Google Ads API did not return any errors. Finally, we'll see a Google Ads feature that acts like an intrinsic set of tips and tricks, recommendations. Before we dive in though, just a reminder, please leave any questions or comments that you may have in the chat. We have a whole team standing by to help you. So let's get started then with our first topic of the day, requests bundling. To create a Performance Max campaign, we need to combine several ingredients, some of which are required. We need a campaign budget, campaign of course, and then we need assets, and we need to link the assets to the campaign, so we need asset groups and asset group assets. Now, there is a gotcha. The campaign budget, the campaign itself, and the assets can be created in separate moments and with separate API requests, while the asset groups and the asset group assets need to be created together in a single request. You can think of this as an atomic transaction that needs to happen all at once. Asset groups can't be created without the required asset group assets, but the asset group assets need to exist within an asset group. It's kind of a chicken and egg problem in that you cannot create one before the other, so they need to be created together. So now you may be wondering, how exactly do I bundle the creation of different resources together in a single API request? One answer is by using the mutate method of the Google Ads service, although it's not the only one, as we will see later. Now, there are a few guidelines to be aware of when using Google Ads service.mutate, not just with Performance Max campaigns, but with any type of operation. As you can see, the request to this method takes a list of generic mutate operations that can be of different types to create different resources. You can combine asset group operations, asset group asset operations, and so on. The way to bundle different resource creation operations together, then, is to create a list of mutate operations and to add different types of operations to it. Here, for instance, we are adding an asset group operation and an asset group asset operation to it. Once we have our list of mutate operations creating different resources, then, we can use it to create a mutate Google Ads request and then pass it to Google Ads service.mutate. This means that we can mutate different resources in a single request, and we can bundle together operations that belong together logically, like the ones to create asset groups and then to link assets to them by creating asset group assets. But that's not all. There's more. Now that we know how to bundle together operations to create different resources, we can take it one step further. If you remember, earlier we said that some of the required resources for Performance Max campaigns can be created in multiple API requests, but that doesn't necessarily mean they should. In fact, we can bundle the operations to create these resources together with the ones to create asset groups and asset group assets, effectively creating all the required resources for a Performance Max campaign in a single API request. But wait. This is not everything. There's even more. While we're bundling together the required resources, why don't we also add to the bundle the ones that are not required, the ones that are optional, like asset group signals or campaign conversion goals or campaign criteria? most definitely can. So now, let me ask you, does this mean that we should always be bundling all the resources we can in a single API request? Well, as to most of the good questions, the answer is actually it depends. There are advantages both in bundling requests and in sending them all separately. Sending each request separately where possible, in fact, allows for easier debugging and, in case of failures or errors, it lets you retry only the single requests that failed. Now, you might be thinking that you can still do this with bundled requests by enabling partial failure, but since asset group operations must be atomic, they don't support partial failure. Bundling operations together, on the other hand, is definitely more efficient and reduces your quota usage because you will be using fewer API requests. This means, for instance, that you can use the separate requests approach during the development phase of your application when you want to familiarize yourself with the API and make debugging and troubleshooting easier. Then, when you want to scale up your application and its API usage, you can switch to using bundled requests. There is also another caveat to keep an eye on when bundling operations together, which is request size. There is a maximum size limit on all API requests, and especially if you are creating several images at once, you may be hitting that limit. To avoid that, one solution would be to create the image assets first, and then in a separate request, the asset groups, asset group assets, and the other resources. Note that when working with asset groups and asset group assets, you should also be careful of the order you bundle your operations in, as there are two rules to follow when bundling operations. First of all, resources that depend on other resources should come after the ones they depend on in the list of operations. Secondly, resources of the same type that are related to the same asset group should be grouped together in the list. This means that in this case, if these two asset group asset operations are related to the same asset group, they need to be close to each other. This is because when it comes to asset and asset group related operations, Google Ads batches all operations for the same resource type together and evaluates the requirements at the end of each batch of resources. For example, if you specify your asset group asset operations in the order on the left of this slide, the validation will happen after the first asset group asset operation, not taking into account the last one because it will be in a different batch, and the whole mutate operation will fail because the asset group asset operations will not satisfy the requirements. If you group the operations by type, with all asset group asset operations at the end instead, the validation will happen at the end of your batch, when all assets have been created. Now, we said that you can bundle operations that rely on each other in a single API request, but how exactly do you do that, given that you don't have the resource name for a resource that hasn't been created yet? Well, the answer is by using temporary IDs. You can use negative integers in your bundled requests to assign temporary IDs to the resources you're creating, and using the same negative integers throughout the bundle of requests will ensure that your resources can reference previously created ones. For instance, here we are using -1 as the ID for a new campaign budget, and by using the same -1 in the campaign budget resource name for a new campaign, we will make sure that the campaign will have the campaign budget that was created in the same request. Of course, this means, again, that the order of operations matters, as we were saying earlier, because you won't be able to create a campaign with a campaign budget that has negative ID -1 if there was no operation to create it before. But that's still not everything. There's a new feature that we recently introduced in the API that will allow you to optimize your Performance Max campaign creation requests even more. Up until recently, batch jobs did not support asset group operations, which meant that you couldn't use a batch job to create all the required resources for a Performance Max campaign. However, beginning in April 2024, you can put asset group operations in a batch job. Some of the rules that we've seen for mutate operations apply to the batch jobs in the same way. For instance, the order of operations is relevant exactly as it was for mutate operations, because the validation rules are the same. It doesn't matter whether you're creating asset groups and asset group assets with a Google Ads service.mutate operation or with a batch job. you still need to order your mutate operations so that operations of the same types are close to each other and that the order of dependencies is respected. This is even more relevant when working with batch jobs, because the operations in a batch job are split into multiple sub-batches by the Google Ads API server. However, each sub-batch that contains a listing group filter operation is treated atomically. By making sure that operations of the same type are close to each other, you also make sure that the number of atomic sub-batches for listing group filters is optimal and that your batch job runs more efficiently. So, now that we know how to optimize our API requests by bundling operations together, let's talk about how to make sure that our requests satisfy the Google Ads requirements in terms of assets. Here, you can see a detail about the minimum and maximum number of assets in an asset group for each asset type. For instance, an asset group for a Performance Max campaign needs to have at least 3 headline text assets, one of which must have at most 15 characters. Generally speaking, though, we recommend having as many assets as possible, not just because it gives your ads more variety, but especially because it gives more inputs to Google AI to learn about your business and optimize your campaign accordingly. For this reason, even if you apply everything that Laura talked about in her reporting session and find out that one of your assets is not performing optimally in ads, we recommend not removing it from your asset groups, as it will still be used by Google AI as an input. Unless, of course, if you are already at the maximum number of assets and you plan to replace the one that you're removing right away. So while we recommend getting as close as possible to the upper limit, trying to create an asset group that is outside of these ranges will lead to an error indicating which of the requirements your asset group is not satisfying. For instance, if your asset group has less than 3 headline text assets, you will receive a not enough headline asset error. And if your asset group has enough description text assets, but none of them is under 60 characters, you will receive a short description required error. However, this is not exactly necessarily always the case. There is an exception to these requirements. If you are creating a Performance Max campaign for online sales with a product feed, also known as a Performance Max campaign for retail, the requirements are slightly different. First of all, you must populate the shopping setting field of your campaign with a few important details such as your Merchant Center account ID and a feed label. Then, you don't necessarily need to add assets, with a detail that we will discuss in a minute. In addition, each asset group in a retail campaign must have a valid product partition tree associated with it at the time of creation. You can even use a single node tree that includes all product in your Merchant Center feed. So you may be wondering, how do I build a product partition tree? You do that by using asset group listing group filters, or AGLGF, for those who, like me, never seem to be able to pronounce the full name correctly, to select which products should be included in your asset groups. Remember, the operation to create asset group listing group filters must be in the same request as the operation to create the associated asset group. Devin went into great detail on AGLGFs in his asset group session, so I recommend you watch his session if you haven't already to learn more about product partitioning. So now, remember that we said that Performance Max for retail campaigns don't necessarily need to have all the required assets that standard Performance Max campaigns need. Here is the detail that you need to keep in mind. When you're working with Performance Max for retail, you can create asset-less asset groups and let Google Ads create the required assets from the Google Merchant Center account that was specified in the campaign shopping setting, retrieving assets like product names, descriptions, and images. However, the fact that you can doesn't necessarily mean that you should. In fact, providing assets other than the product-related ones that are automatically created from the linked Google Merchant Center account can help maximize the reach of your Performance Max for retail campaigns across all Google Ads surfaces. So, what's the detail I was just mentioning then? It's that you can add your own assets to an asset-less Performance Max campaign for online sales with a product feed. And it's generally a good idea to do so, because it will also provide more inputs to Google AI to create successful ads. However, your assets still need to comply with the asset requirements that we've just seen. At least 3 headlines, at least 1 log headline, and so on and so forth. So you can go entirely assetless then, or you have to meet all the asset requirements. There's no in-between where you just provide a few assets. Besides, when you want to create a performance max for retail campaign with all required assets, or to add your own assets to an assetless one, this needs to be done in a single atomic request, because as we were saying earlier, the asset group validation needs to ensure that the asset group you are creating satisfies all requirements, or it will fail entirely. So now we have seen how to bundle requests together to create performance max campaigns efficiently, and how to make sure that your campaigns comply with the Google Ads requirements and even go beyond the minimum requirements. Does this mean that we can be sure that our performance max campaigns are always going to be serving, or to be serving optimally? Well, again, not necessarily. A performance max campaign can indeed end up in what we call an invalid state, which is a state that does not trigger an API error, but where a campaign is not delivering impressions as you would expect. What does that mean? As we've just seen, violating an asset requirement at any time, both when creating or updating an asset group, will throw an error. But there are cases when you seem to have done everything correctly and yet you didn't. For instance, you just created a performance max campaign but then forgot to link an asset group to it, or you did but the campaign is paused. These are all perfectly fine situations from an API request and response perspective, but they are not okay for your campaign because it will not serve any ads. So how do you find out if you unintentionally ended up in one of these cases? Well, there are fields in the API for that. You can check the primary status both at the campaign level and at the asset group level to make sure that their value is eligible, meaning that your campaign and asset groups are serving correctly. If they have a different value, you can find out more about what's going wrong by looking at the primary status results field, both for the campaign and for the asset group. They will tell you exactly all the reasons why you may not be getting the performances you were hoping for. For instance, an asset group may have primary status not eligible, and that can be caused by several reasons, mostly related to the campaign it belongs to. Among the reasons that can cause this state, in fact, there are reasons like campaign ended, which is the case when the campaign the asset group belongs to is past its end date, and the asset group thus is not delivering any impressions because of this. In this case, all you have to do is just resume your campaign to make sure your asset group starts serving again. So now, we've covered several Google Ads API tips and tricks to make your applications more smooth and optimized. But if you're familiar with Google Ads and its API, I think you know that they both provide some sort of intrinsic optimization tips and tricks with recommendations. Performance Max makes no exception, and there are some recommendations that can help you optimize your campaigns even further. The way they do so is by helping you improve your ad strength and, in general, your ad performance. There is a value called optimization score, or OptiScore, that tells you how well your campaigns are set to perform and how much room for improvement we think there is if you apply our recommendations. The recommendation service of the Google Ads API allows you to retrieve the recommendation we have for your campaigns, and then you can either apply them or dismiss them using the same service. In Performance Max, asset group strength and asset group signals recommendations can improve your optimization score. The Google Ads API provides a recommendation type, Improve Performance Max Ad Strength, which highlights asset groups that should be improved to reach an excellent strength rating. This feature is especially useful for third-party advertisers that enable users to create and manage asset groups. Then, there are 2 recommendation types to help you optimize your audience signals. Refresh Customer Match List recommends updating a customer list which hasn't been refreshed in some time. This is useful if the audiences you're using as an asset group signal contain customer lists. Improve Google Tag Coverage recommends deploying the Google tag across more of your website to improve conversion tracking. This can lead to improved accuracy of your conversion reporting, which can in turn lead to more accurate audience signals for your asset groups. Finally, there are two recommendation types that help you choose the right bidding strategy between maximize conversions and maximize conversion value, and can also provide a suggested budget amount. There's even more. Since version 16 of the Google Ads API, you can use recommendations to improve not just your already existing campaigns, but also to preemptively optimize your campaigns while you're still creating them. The generate recommendations method of the recommendation service, in fact, can be used during your campaign creation flow to make sure that by the time your users are done creating a Performance Max campaign, it already has a high optimization score. So, let's do a quick recap of everything we've seen. We began by discussing when you need to send API operations bundled together to link assets to asset groups, and how you can bundle together even more operations to increase the efficiency of your API requests. Then, we saw how to make sure that your bundled operations are in the right order, ensuring that resources that depend on other resources in the same request are created later than the ones that depend on. After that, while we were talking about the requirements that your asset groups need to satisfy, we also discussed exactly what these requirements are for different types of Performance Max campaigns. Then, we talked about the cases when creating or updating a Performance Max campaign does not return any errors, but still the campaign is not serving optimally, and how the primary status field may help you troubleshoot these cases. And finally, we just discussed how recommendations act as kind of an intrinsic set of tips, tricks, and best practices to make sure that your campaigns perform optimally. We've seen several different ways to make sure everything goes as you expect when working with Performance Max with the Google Ads API. But if you're interested in learning even more about troubleshooting, I recommend you revisit Devin's session about asset groups from earlier today. And if you're interested in a real-world demonstration of how to build an application that creates and manages Performance Max campaigns, stay tuned. Devin himself is going to be hosting a session right after this one that demonstrates how to put many of the concepts I discussed in practice to use, as he shows how to design a custom PMax interface and a pipeline. He'll even demonstrate a methodology for automatically fixing certain errors and easily structuring related requests to adhere to some of the requirements that I just discussed. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this session useful and that you got some insights on how to improve your Performance Max implementation.